Child of God is a 1973 novel by Cormac McCarthy. I read it earlier, I want to say late last year or earlier this year, so it's actually kind of fresh in my memory, though I did have to kind of dig back a little bit to do some work to kind of remember some of the characters and the names and the finer details. So, yeah, this is a wild ride of a book. It was oddly entertaining in a very morbid, dark way. But very imaginative yet starkly realistic at the same time. So it's about a man, a very fringe of society kind of man named Lester Ballard, and it's loosely based off of, I think, an unnamed Chattanooga, Tennessee serial killer who went around and basically stored all the bodies of his victims in caves, which is what the character of Lester Ballard, spoiler alert, does in the novel. It's a fairly brief novel. You get like a really really packed in kind of look into the psychology and the pure of just how much of an outcast this guy is, how lonely he is too. You feel like some empathy. I did, but only with a certain degree. You felt like an empathy, like you do with some psychopaths. But then you realize, at the end, you're like, okay, well, he's totally off his rockers. He's completely. But yeah, he ends up being evicted from an already kind of downtrodden kind of area. He's in this home, almost basically a trailer park. You get the sense that Lester Ballard is kind of, he's this guy maybe not quite middle-aged, maybe his 30s, and I don't know if it gives an indication of his age in his book, but but basically gives kind of this singular view into his life, with the narrative switching back and forth because you get kind of narratives from other people's point of view. You get kind of almost removed omniscient third person narrator into Lester's point of view, but then you also get these different kind of accounts of. Kind of remind me of the narrative style in Steppenwolf, Hermann Hesse, but there's also you get different kind of perspectives from these other people that knew Lester Ballard, almost like criminal reports, almost almost like investigative kind of interviews of that kind of shed some light into his life, into more of a objective light, and then you get the kind of really subjective, kind of ghostly. Classic kind of Cormac McCarthyan narrator, hovering over the whole story and informing every move. So basically, yeah, he's evicted and then he's homeless basically, and the stuff that he had before, I think I said, it wasn't really much of a improvement at all. So Lester Ballard starts wandering around. He does have one friend. Even though he's not married, he doesn't have any, really doesn't know any woman, really intimately, and doesn't really have any attachment to any relationships, really, and, who knows if he ever did. But yeah, he is, off, but he does have one friend, but he finds out that I think they end up, there's this, cabin he starts squatting in, and it turns out this cabin's he's basically, I think, accused of taking advantage of this woman, which surprisingly Lester didn't do, and he's kicked out. So he's basically trying to find this friend, and it turns out things don't pan out with his friend either. So he's basically at a total loss for what to do. So Lester basically starts, it starts off with voyeurism. He starts looking at these other couples being intimate out in their, cars and whatnot, and then but then he stumbles upon a dead couple in a car, and then he ends up doing the unthinkable. He takes, he basically commits. I don't know if there's any proper way of saying this without being totally, censored on YouTube. But he necrophilia. He's commits necrophilia with the corpse of the people in the car abandoned, and then he basically drives takes their bodies and then goes to this cave. He stores them in this cave where he stumbles upon, I think he's already finds that there's bodies in the cave, I think, or no, wait, no, but he stores them, and it's kind of like you have to go underwater. I'm not too familiar with Tennessee's landscape, aside from the fact that, like maybe driving past Cave City when I was on, up, back and forth up. Usually I never really quite stayed and like sojourned around Tennessee enough to really get a scope of the area, but I do imagine it's very, the caves are pretty, up and down. There's this really funny, hilarious kind of story that the internet historian did about a man it's actually just called Man Stuck in Cave, and it's like this hour and a half long kind of deep dive, but he's very engaging. He's pretty well known, so it's like, you guys already know about the internet historian, but I just really liked how he kept you kind of engaged in the story about this guy that trapped in a cave, and how these people are, all these people are trying to like make kind of money off of it, and it's like early 1900s, so people are trying to telephone the president at the time, I guess. I don't know if it was Taft or what, but Coolidge maybe. But yeah, this is like early 1900s, I think, the 1910s or something. So yeah, like basically people were trying to make any way, but not actually helping the guy trapped in the cave. I can't remember his name, but he actually died in the cave, sadly, because he basically starved to death, I guess, and they tried drilling him out. They did try, but it was just surprising how, well, maybe not for the time period, of just how many people looked at it as a spectacle of like, oh, like kind of that onlooker observer effect, but not actually being bothered to actually dig in their heels and actually help the guy out, for crying out loud. So anyway, but like, that just kind of reminded me of that. But yeah, Lester Ballard is, he's quite kind of a slick, kind of weird guy. I should have mentioned right off the bat, the namesake of this novel, Child of God, is right in the first few pages, I think. You get like this thing where it's like Lester Ballard is, is described as much like a child of God, much like yourself, perhaps, as McCarthy says. In a way that kind of reminded me also of his later work in the 80s with Blood Meridian, probably his most famous novel of all time. Not just McCarthy's, but just kind of great as far as being in the canon of American literature. It is just like, completely, I did a loner and an outsider, that to the point where, like the stuff that, like, the only person that would actually spend the night with him is somebody that's dead, is just very sad. Like very kind of, like a little bit sad, like you feel bad for him, but then you're like, then there's another point about like, okay, well, he clearly I think there's some code. I think he crossed. There's obviously, but like there's also the interesting thing to do with the nature of the crimes too. Like what is, are serial killers, are they shaped, are they made, are they nurtured into existence, or are they just a biological weird thing? Is it a blank slate, a tabula rasa? Is it like a Lockean, as in like John Locke, kind of, are people with psychopathic tendencies, are they brooded, are they, prodded into existence, are they made by, like, is it a Emil Durkheim thing, I think, where one of his theories about sociology was that like people, like crimes in general, ranging from the petty theft to the more extreme killings, they're actually indicative of a unjust government, like a natural kind of revolt against that, a subversion of authority. Now, there's so many different ways to look at it. This is why I love this book on a thematic basis, though it's tough to read. It is, it does have a lot of different takes and themes packed in there in this little book. So, yeah. And then, Lester Ballard, spoiler alert again, he ends up, after going to the hospital, and then being committed to a kind of just insane asylum, kind of where he's living out his basic, last days. He actually falls ill with pneumonia, and basically it's not until later, after he dies, that they actually find the rest of his bodies. I think they do know that he's responsible for something, but they actually don't find the bodies till like a good while later, and that's like you're going back and forth between kind of people, the accounts of people who knew him. McCarthy kind of like uses that as kind of like bringing it back to reality of like, and then you go back into the more unfettered, wild nature of the outlaw kind of mentality of Ballard's inner world. Like you go into his inner psychological depths, and then it's just like all that horror, and then you go out of it, and then you're like, okay, now we're back to reality. And like these are the people, like the rest of the people, like the police accounts or like his friend, people who knew him at least. I wouldn't say friends, but people who knew of him at least, to give their account. So yeah, I like how it switches back and forth to kind of add some bearing on reality. Basically, this is the an interesting thing too is like that McCarthy also wasn't huge on magic realism. I mean, there was some quotes of him saying it's not like he hated magic realism. I mean, I think he had a soft spot for people like Jorges, from what I heard, but he did kind of lump him in with other people like Marquez and like I'm not sure if Saramago would be considered magic realism. Maybe some of the modernists, and there's a bit of a crossover, but I think Jorges would be more philosophical short fiction. Like he's the master of the short story. In fact, I think the only thing I've ever read by him are short stories. So, but yeah, he's got like I think a good. Some of the stuff with magic realism, I think McCarthy had a problem with, is that you can kind of just spin stuff up off the top of your head, and you're like, okay, well, if I'm going, I know I'm butchering the quote that he said, but like if I can basically sit there and just kind of write all this stuff about, oh well, then it was all just a dream, or it was all just the stuff in, for example, in 100 Years of Solitude, like all that stuff is just the imaginings of the Bonando family, and like how, and the Macondo is like this great big kind of just dream, like fantasy. It's all reverie, so it's like kind of interesting. But yeah, I think where McCarthy, he's like saying like reality is they're at the stark realism of stuff. That's where like the juice of like there's a lot of meat for storytelling. Like he was saying that Lester Ballard is basically like, you've probably met somebody like him, because he might be at the fringe of society, but you might actually be able to kind of like just go out there and like with my experience, short stint with like construction, working with some of the people out there that were like very, very like misogynistic, and like like just like openly just talking about like how they would like basically force themselves on women and stuff like that, or at least joke about it just in a very glib manner. And like you're thinking that these people are just they exist. Like you just go a few steps back, it takes a little while, but like if you just like kind of open up your ear a little bit. I mean, I know it sounds strange to like emphasize with these type of people, because you don't want to give them too much ground, like otherwise you're like you're like going too far, like in the case of like Mindhunter with all the serial killers, and you're emphasizing with Ed Kemper, and you're like, hey, you're shooting the shit with these guys, and it's just like, no, you want to keep your distance, I think. Same thing with these people, but I think it's important to realize that at the end of the day there are people like this in the world. Like you just go back, literally look up Soft White Underbelly, pretty well-known guy on YouTube. I don't watch all too much of his stuff, just because like you're kind of like, some of them I get the idea that what he's going for is like, okay, well, like some of the stuff with like former drug addicts or former this, or like hour-long interview with former pimp, and it's like some of the stuff is like a little bit like, it's like I get it, like these people exist, like there are people that aren't necessarily, they're made out to be kind of like untouchables, right? Like the underbelly, but like at the same time they're also in the streets. Like you just talk to people like in the projects, or in this area in like California, and like very people who are part of gangs, and like seeing people die, or people like that one guy who literally had his head blown off, part of his head blown off because of a robbery, and he just got kind of roped into it. So you have, yeah, definitely a lot of people like want to kind of pretend these, and I'll admit I myself don't really want to. I'll be like, yeah, I know these people exist, but I don't want to see it. I don't want to like bask in it though. I don't know if that's just my personal thing, but there are times when I, the curiosity I'll fall down the rabbit hole of that stuff. And one of his more telling ones, I probably was like the Wilkersons, I think. They were a family that was so inbred, so far gone, that there was one man who was never learned how to speak or read. More evidently, the fact that he didn't know how to speak because of the fact that he was actually aping, like literally barking in the same manner of a dog, which is like it was like sad to see that this guy was like so like he was like yipping and yapping in the cadence of a dog, because that's the only mark of like it's a weird like Wittgensteinian kind of way of like language is like doesn't really proceed, but like you have to utilize what you have in your surroundings, and you're like, okay, well, there's that dog barking, so that signifies that I want attention, but I don't know the word. I don't know like the Platonic kind of word, because there is no, in I guess Wittgenstein sense, but word to indicate that I'm hungry, for example. So I'm just gonna go yip 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 or something, and then that will get people's attention, because this is how far gone, and they still are there. Like people, I mean, they ask that like you don't visit their property, but they're only not to give my location away, but like they're only like I looked up the Odd, Ohio. No wait, Odd, West Virginia. I think Odd City. A lot of those places in like West Virginia or Kentucky have strange names like Cave City or Odd City, just like kind of yeah. I mean, I know there's like the kind of like sophomore joke of like Intercourse, Pennsylvania, where I'm from Pennsylvania. But yeah, but it's like passed away like a couple years back. But yeah, she I think that was like in Colorado. So you can find little places like this to kind of like like the world's like your oyster for all this kind of manipulation. And but yeah, anyway. So that is Child of God by Cormac McCarthy. Yeah, there was a adaptation that I forgot to talk about. Adaptation, sorry. James Franco, I think, directed it, and I can't remember who starred as Lester though. But I haven't seen it, but I have it on my list definitely to watch. The same thing with The Road. I still got to watch that, even though I heard mixed things. But it has Viggo Mortensen in it, and I heard he at least gave a lot to the film. But on the other side, there's Franco's adaptation. He was talking to Cormac McCarthy, like trying to like pick his brain a little bit of like how, what inspired him to write this. And he's like, I think he just kind of gave almost like a BS answer, but like a purposeful, because McCarthy's like that. I'm gleaning a little bit more as time goes on, and as I read more of his stuff, just taking away a little bit more of his life. And like he was in poverty too. Like he was like I don't know, there's probably some BS answer, like I think what he said to Franco, and he was like some BS thing, I'm not sure why he wrote Child of God, but I think it came down to like he was like low on money, and he was like trying to write something that was passionate, that had like some meaning to it, but he was also trying to like get at least some money. But at the same time, his wife said that complained actually that he wouldn't advocate, or he wouldn't do book readings or signings or talk with publishers and and do kind of like the advertiser kind of stuff, because he was like, he just didn't like doing that. He wanted to keep a mystery of himself. And I think with that, there's like a treasured aspect of like just sticking to yourself on your guns on this, and not being leaving stuff to interpretation, leaving it, rather than doing like an interview or doing this or that, or like a director's commentary kind of thing where you just kind of spill the beans totally on the movie and how it was done, which I like certain authors who are like very open about their books. Like I'm not sure like off the top of my head, but maybe someone like Salman Rushdie or something who's like maybe comfortable doing interviews and talking about stuff about like his influences and what his stuff. But I think with McCarthy, I like that he kept all the way up until he passed away last year at very old age of like 89 or something. But yeah, I like that he kept that to like he left that in an enigmatic part of him. So anyway, so yeah, thank you for watching. Child of God, Cormac McCarthy, definitely recommend, and I'll see you in the next one.